Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eva Hanáková, and I would like to welcome you all to this second morning panel discussion. We are going to talk about the rapid technological developments of last few years and their impact on the information space and democracy in particular. And it's really my great honor to introduce our four distinguished panelists. I will start with ladies. So at my right hand, it's Vivian Schiller, CEO of Civil Foundation. Just opposite to me, it's Suzanne Nocel, Executive Director of Pan American Center. On my left hand, it's Jonathan Ledgard, former correspondent of The Economist and now technologist and a novelist. And just opposite to me, it's Ondřej Vlček, the only Czech person and speaker at this panel, and he's Executive Vice President of Avast company. First, I want to start with a round of, let's say, one or two questions for each of you panelists, which will give us the overview of your background and of the recent activities that are connected with the chosen topics or topic, which is precisely the future of information and the impact on democracy. All our guests are real insiders, so they will definitely tell you everything they know about the topic and share their opinions on the given thing. And in case they don't, you will definitely have the opportunity to ask them. And I hope the discussion will be really vivid as much as possible. So let's start. First with Suzanne, pardon. Suzanne, I think that you are really the best person here to talk about the topic that is really very important for today's world, and it's free expression and the future of free media, and how we can, fix it, and how we can, let's say, to make the situation much better. Suzanne is CEO of Pan America, as I already told you, but previously she was working for Amnesty International USA. She is a veteran of both the Obama and Clinton administration. But Suzanne is also a journalist, because she's still, or a contributor till now, because she's still writing very interesting articles about free of speech and free of expression to foreign policy, for instance, or to the Wall Street Journal. Suzanne, I know that your organization, Pan America, quite recently published a very important an interesting report about faking news. So can you please address the current threats to free speech that we are having now? And do you personally think that fake news are really the biggest threats to free expression nowadays?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having me, and thanks for bringing up all those important topics. In terms of fake news, we did a report positioning the issue of fake news as a crisis for free expression. And you might not intuitively think of it that way, because almost all fake news is, at least in the United States context, and I think in other rights-respecting countries around the world, considered protected expression. I mean, you're allowed to lie, you're allowed to put out satire, you're allowed to mischaracterize, as long as under US law it stops short of libel or slander or defamation, which are really very narrow categories of speech that are not protected by law, where someone can be punished or the speech can be prohibited. Short of that, you're free to publish whatever you want. And in the physical world, publication went through various layers of vetting. If you were publishing in a magazine, there was an editor commissioning the piece, there was somebody fact-checking the piece. Oftentimes, it was going through a publishing house to get into a book. The same thing. On the internet, those boundaries have been taken down completely, and anybody can put out anything, and there's incredible power to that. Your ideas can get traction all over the world. You can reach audiences that would otherwise be totally inaccessible. But what we've seen, particularly over the last few years, is that it also opens up incredible opportunities to distort, to push out propaganda, to confuse, to bamboozle. And we see now a couple of consequences of that. Lowest levels of trust in the media ever in recorded history, as long as there's been polling. 32% of the US public now says that they trust the news media, similar levels, if not lower, around the rest of the world. Confusion, 64% of American adults saying they've been genuinely confused about what is fact, what is falsehood, about basic, fundamental stories of current events. The rampant spread of fake news. So a third of people saying they regularly see stories that are not legitimate. A fourth of internet users saying they've passed along or shared such stories. And all of it is compounded in our country, but not just, with a deliberate campaign of attack by our president on the legitimate news media. Cries of fake news, calling the media the enemy of the American people, sowing deliberate misunderstanding of what reports are valid and legitimate and what are false. And so this has conspired to create a real crisis of confidence in what is truth and what is falsehood, and that undermines our democracy in so many different ways. If you think about democratic decision-making, the voters' ability to make an educated choice at the ballot box, and how we understand the fundamentals of public policy.
How to fix it?
Say it again?
How to fix it?
How to fix it. I mean, there's no, there's no easy or single answer. And, we call for steps by the internet platforms, by newsrooms, and by the individual consumer. We think ultimately the solution is inoculating the consumer so they are equipped, informed, and able to discern between fact and falsehood. And, but we've lost many, many years in terms of educating our young people about how to read this new kind of news, how to understand what a byline is, what a dateline is, what news sources can be believed, who's behind them, what their agenda is. So there's a lot of ground to be caught up on. And I think, at a larger level, we also have to recognize this has become a tool of warfare, information warfare, country to country, and we have to take that very seriously as well. I think the news consumer piece is very important, but if we don't tackle it at a larger level, I think ultimately that's going to fall short.
I was participating in the previous panel, and the speakers here, we are mentioning the importance of free press and free journalism for the future. I asked the question how to fix it, and maybe there is one person who might somehow maybe know how to fix it. Because Vivian, you spent most of your career as a senior executive at traditional media organization. You are a real veteran. So you worked for CNN, for the New York Times. You used to be the president of National Public Radio. Then you totally changed your career path and you started to work for the new media, so precisely for a social platform Twitter. But quite recently you decided to join a very interesting startup that is trying, as I've already mentioned, maybe try to fix journalism, and with the help of new technology, which is really interesting. So first, can you explain how exactly your project, named Civil Foundation, works, and how it might, let's say, fix journalism? And maybe, because I've read an article about you, and there was written that in your own words, Civil Foundation, your current organization, is going to be an antidote to platforms such as Twitter.
Yes, so thank you for having me, and yeah, I would love to talk about Civil. I'm going to talk about Civil, the platform. Civil Foundation is doing something, that is the part that I'm running, that's going to be making grants, but it is slightly different. So yes, I've spent my entire career in legacy media, and I've seen many, everything that Suzanne said is absolutely, of course, the case, and we're seeing the erosion of trust in news, and actually the erosion of a foundation of agreed upon evidence-based fact. And so this is an incredibly troubling phenomenon that's happening around the world. At the same time, we're also seeing the further erosion of the ability for news organizations to be able to financially support themselves. So you have these twin crises in sustainability and trust, and together it is profoundly affecting the ability for people around the world to get the information that they need in order to participate in their communities and their societies. So I'd always been sort of on the part of the news organizations putting news out into the world. When I moved to Twitter, it was really about saying, well, wait a minute, as more and more people are consuming their news on our devices, how can we make sure that these platforms provide that? Unfortunately, the platforms did not do a very good job. They had a failure of imagination when they were being formed, and just did not imagine all of the ways that this technology could be used by bad actors. There was sort of this Silicon Valley techno utopianism that sort of said that if we open things up and we put tools into everybody's hands, it will bring out the greater good in people, and unfortunately, that's just not the case. So we're trying to build a new platform that over time, I don't want to overpromise that this will instantly be some kind of grand solution to everything, but over time, we'll get at both of these crises that are happening in journalism. So we're building a network for trustworthy news organizations that is going to be managed in a completely decentralized manner by people who will be incented to keep that network of news organizations free of bad actors and just include new news organizations. And the means to do that, and it will take too long for me to go into a lot of details here, is through a form of cryptocurrency which you can use to both govern the network and that you can also use to financially support news organizations. And there's built-in checks and balances. We've tried to imagine, I literally wake up in the middle of the night thinking all the ways this can be gamed and all the ways that this can go wrong, so we anticipate those, and we've built in all kinds of checks and balances and all kinds of mechanisms and gating factors to be able to support this effort. And it's for news organizations around the world, particularly with a focus on news organizations in what we call news deserts, whether it's in the US or any place around the world where there's just not enough accountability reporting, and also around subjects that are not being sufficiently covered. So that is what we're building, and we're pretty excited about it.
Are you even considering to create your own, let's say, newsroom and to publish a special kind of publication on a regular basis?
No, we are not a newsroom. We are not going to, I'm a journalist, but we're not hiring journalists to actually do reporting. It is purely, we're building a platform that will be, like I said, completely decentralized. It'll be managed and operated by the public, but again, with these gates so that it can't be gamed. And but we are trying to support other news organizations, whether they're very small or very large. But we ourselves are not going to be a news organization.
Great, thank you. Interesting project, really. Jonathan, when I was looking at your bio, I would say that you are like a kind of Renaissance man, which I mean very positively, because as I've already mentioned, Jonathan used to work like 10 years for The Economist.
20.
20 years for The Economist. Majority of these years we are in Africa, am I right? Then you wrote 2 books. One of them was actually filmed by Wim Wenders, am I right? Submergence. And the second one, actually it's the first one, Nobel, it's being based on a story from Czechoslovakia, because you also were the correspondent of The Economist in Czech Republic in 2001. But quite recently, you just like to decide, let's say, to leave the media business, and you began a brand new project. And you want to build the world's very first drone port in Africa, which is really interesting. I want to ask you why you left the media business. You were so disappointed you didn't like see any like sight or light at the end of the tunnel, or why you left media business. And the second question is much more connected with your, let's say, your interests and your love as for Africa, because you know in general. I think that many people expected that technology are going to be important tools as for the empowerment of democracy, but it somehow didn't happen. So why technology hasn't delivered more democracy? What's up?
What's up? WhatsApp. So I didn't want to leave the media. You know, I was very happy being a foreign correspondent and a war correspondent, especially for The Economist, which was and is one of the few English language publications which actually funds its journalists to go and report in depth. The thing was, I ended up moving to Africa in the early 2000s when the mobile phone arrived in Africa. And so my first couple of years in Africa was really, you know, traditional kind of stories about Africa. But then I got very interested in the mobile phone as a truly, and there's no question, apart from climate change and loss of biodiversity, the mobile phone was the biggest story in Africa in the last, 10, 15 years. It proved, which is essential to this discussion, right? It proved that even if you're a very poor person, you have access to this meta universe. So the entire planet is just covered with information and video and so on and so forth. That, anyway, led me down the rabbit hole into advanced technology. And I think anyone who spends any time in Africa or emerging economies knows that the next 10, 15 years, it will be transformative for our species. Like decisions we make right now, and some of you may have seen the IPCC report today about climate change, keeping it down to 1.5 degrees rather than 2. But you know, if we just return to the essential point of discussion, which is information flow technology, you know, the mobile phone has changed everything. I don't want to be rude, but our species were not very bright individually. I mean, if we take a kind of neuroscience point of view, we just have a limited hard drive. Because we've moved from print to visual media and from print to audio as well, you know, our brains are just overloaded. And we're very, very easily gamed. And Vivian made, you know, very noble to criticize her former employer at Twitter. But I think the Silicon Valley algorithmic structure, it has been driven by venture capital. It hasn't been driven by civil values of what a society should be. Of course, they would defend and say, oh, no, no. But essentially, they want to sell more advertising. You know? So they're prepared to game the human mind and the human emotions considerably. So when we just, I'll just lay out this one very basic point before we get into the other stuff. It's like everything that we're talking about is coming through this. and whatever the next generation of this will be, which will probably be some form of augmented reality, to have a very limited brain time every day, very limited ability to focus on stories. So unless the media, and the media, particularly in democratic countries, is going to focus on quality, profound quality, and unless people are actually willing to pay for that, we're not going to be able to move the dial on this issue at all. And in particular, because now I'm a visiting professor in artificial intelligence, and if you look at what is about to happen with AI being injected, as it were, into the existing streams, and already Twitter does employ a lot of AI scientists and machine learning specialists. So we're really heading into a really dodgy period where, if you simplify everything, the compact for the society has to be, I'm going to pay for something that's of decent quality. Just as I would pay to have a BMW, I'm going to have to pay to have that media. Now, if you can't win that particular piece of the argument, then you're finished, really, as a democratic society, maybe even finished as a civilization.
Oh.
Definitely.
Oh, you're very positive. Well, we will definitely talk later about AI and the future, let's say, development of AI and its impact on press freedom and on democracy in general. But I want also to give our floor to Andrei Vlček first. Andrei is working, or has been working, for Avast company, which is like a very famous cybersecurity company based in Czech Republic. I think that you do have nowadays, let's say, 500,000 users all around the world. Am I right? Something like this.
400 million.
400 million, sorry. 400 million. Andrei is number 2 in this company. He's executive vice president and general manager. And I would say that Andrei is really one of the most respected personalities in Czech tech community. As we have already discussed here, and maybe Jonathan mentioned, tech is disrupting all like what we had known before, even democracy. So how can global players, such as Avast, affect future of democracy through engaging new technologies? It would be my first question. And the second question, I think that you are really very pro-democratic, or having a pro-democratic approach, because as I know, you hired Garry Kasparov as your security evangelist. Why you decided to do this?
Okay, sure. Thank you. So, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be, humbled to be in this group of impressive speakers. In terms, I'm gonna be the technologist here in the room. This is my life. I've been doing this for over 23 years now. So I have seen this pretty interesting development to Vivian's earlier point, from kind of this transformation of, tech startups who had some ambitions, some dreams to build, to maybe change the world to do better, and now gradually seeing those same platforms, those same technologies to be somehow misused, abused by the bad actors. And it's not quite obvious what it means and where it's going to move, because as of today, the bad actors are still relatively benign in the sense that the actual influence that they have is relatively limited. What I mean by that is that we are still very much before the era of AI in the real sense of word. And so even today, like with fake news and all these things that are clearly emerging, we're still relatively early, I would say, in the adoption curve, because we haven't still seen so much of, for example, fake news being truly generated by AI in larger quantities that anyone of us can even imagine. And that's undoubtedly coming. The technology is going to enable that in not so distant future. And of course, it's going to become much bigger problem from the technology perspective. How do we defend against that, or how do we find ways to protect the integrity of society and democracy? And so my sense today is that many of these companies are kind of caught unprepared in some ways. That is, they are doing the right things in terms of the tactical stuff. They are doing the right things in terms of protecting their systems, putting more security, investing more money in securing their systems, or providing security for consumers and for corporations. But at the same time, sometimes kind of lack the longer-term strategic view of how to actually tackle these problems, especially in the era of AI. And that's I think, going to be, I mean, the optimist in me sees that as a huge opportunity for a new breed of startups, like maybe it's Vivian's startup or other startups that are going to take the action and somehow disrupt the space further by providing solutions that are going to be better in this regard. And then to your second question, how we hired Gary. So Gary, we started working with Gary about 3 years ago. I think our first involvement with Gary was we invited him here to Prague to actually be our spokesperson for our grand opening of the new Prague headquarters office. And the angle was quite different, because Gary clearly is I mean, as a former chess grandmaster, and someone who was kind of beaten for the first time by machine. He was kind of the epitome of that, battle between men and machines. So we had him present that angle. But after our discussion, one interesting thing happened, and that was, I mean, we more and more felt like Gary actually is someone who has even more to say about things like freedom of speech, privacy, security, all these things that are very much in the realm of our business and what we are doing every day, our bread and butter. And we started engaging with Gary around these things as well. So Gary has been working with us for about 3 years now. He's very active blogging on our company blog. I recommend you to check out some of his posts on our blog. Very, very enlightening. I've been very happy with the cooperation.
Andre, you mentioned AI and the future development. Jonathan said something similar. We are all expecting the artificial intelligence will soon fabricate videos, images, and voiceovers, and further putting the truth at risk. Let me ask you the question, and it's a question for all of you. So do you think that, or could AI kill off democracy? And one more question, which is being really connected with this issue. So, and it's much more, let's say, down to earth. Are technological giants a threat to democracy? Because you have mentioned, not specifically, but we are talking about the companies such as Facebook, such as Twitter, that on the one hand, they maybe are lagging, as you mentioned, and maybe they are just like, having some of the problems that are a little bit surprising even for them. But on the other hand, the companies such as Facebook is, for instance, doing business in countries such as Turkey or China or Russia. They are, they are in favor of censorship. We can see it because they are deleting some kind of content, etc., etc. So. Who will start? Yeah.
Can I take the first one?
Yeah.
So the question, you're talking about these so-called deep fakes, this, and that technology, I mean, you're the technology expert, but it is here today. It's not widely distributed, but it is a real thing, the ability to manipulate images and manipulate audio so that you can create the impression of somebody saying something that they never actually said. My personal prediction is that when this begins to be more readily available in the wild, there will be an initial sort of flurry of people going, you know, thinking that something is real, but that will quickly move to the next stage, which is nobody believes anything they see whatsoever. And that is a terrifying proposition because the civilization rests on us at least agreeing on a foundation of basic truths. Mm-hmm. You know, that the ground is underneath us, the sky is blue. I mean, things that we can experience and we can agree on in the world, evidence-based, science-based information. From that foundation of truth, people form different opinions. But what's happening now between the combination of the prospect of these deep fakes, and also with certain political leaders, including the President of the United States, saying, don't believe anything you see from the media. Believe me. Listen to me. They are enemy of the people. This is destroying trust in this foundation of how we have gotten information. And that creates an opening where if you don't believe anything that you see, you don't believe your own eyes, that creates an opening for sort of very charismatic leaders like to some, the president, you know, Trump is a charismatic leader, to say, you know what, he's the only person I can believe. And that's a terrifying prospect, and that leads to, you know, can lead to totalitarianism. I mean, we've seen these very same kind of efforts, this kind of manipulation, you know, only listen to me in totalitarian regimes in the past.
Yes, but what's the solution? It's like, it's again, because it's like...
I'm actually, I'm a lot more optimistic. I feel that we're in a period of flux. It's kind of like the Edwardian period just before the First World War, where, you know, you have this new media coming along, and there's a sort of increase in the metabolism of the planet in every possible indicator, but particularly in the velocity of information. And we're just kind of spun around and a little bit disorientated at the moment. I actually think that just as we were mentioning this before, Vivian, you know, just as people learn to value good coffee and good food, they're taking care of their bodies a lot better. You know, people don't smoke so much. I think it's inevitable that we'll start taking care of our minds a little bit better, and that, you know, after the wellness movement will come a sense of, you know, what is the quality of what. But as they say, the business model has to be there. Facebook has to be destroyed and brought down, and I'm really militant on that. When I was in Africa, my lab did some research on Facebook at a really robust level between my university in Switzerland and MIT. And what we found was that if I was a 16-year-old Muslim girl from the Kikuyu tribe in Kenya, and I go into my classroom in my gymnasium in Nairobi. In my class, I have boys who are Christian, and then boys who are Muslim, and boys from different tribes, and then I have girls from different religions and different tribes. And in the classroom, I'm fine. I'm fine. I really get along very well with them, and everything's normal. On Facebook, forget it. No, on Facebook, there is a constant pressure and narrowing, and what is left is very small groups, echo chambers. The United States, and, you know, I'm as critical of American liberals as I am of American conservatives in this. You know, I mean, a lot of the liberal media in the States is as complicit as conservative media. I'm not on any side, but those kind of echo chambers which digitally happen, Facebook, I think in particular, has to take a large share of the blame for the situation we're in. But, I don't blame it overall. I just think they have a lousy technology and a lousy business model. And someone else will come along with a little bit more refined business model. But I don't think, I agree with Andre that AI is a medium-term play. I don't see it in the next couple of years being a defining moment. I think more one should focus on visual culture. So how do people, especially young people, how do they receive information visually? Because anyone who's been a journalist knows that television news, apart from a few breaking stories, is not a great way of articulating subtlety. It often increases polarity and so on and so forth. So I think we just need to be very focused on how people actually, handle their mobile phone, their laptop, how things come to them. But certainly I would be really militant about attacking news streams and news aggregators and forcing or encouraging in a positive way people to move from aggregated news towards curated news. Because people are just not very good editors of what they want, that's reality. I know I'm not.
Suzanne?
Well, think about your question, are the tech giants threats to democracy? I think we have to unpack that a little bit. I don't think they're deliberate threats to democracy. I think, Vivian's right. They were sort of spurned out of a really utopian vision of making communication and connection accessible to anybody, allowing people to mobilize movements, to organize, to promulgate a point of view that might not otherwise get heard. And there's a lot of power to that. And I don't think we should forget about that entirely. I mean, without it, there would be, whole movements and campaigns for rights that could not get started, that could not catch on. The resistance that we have in the U.S. is largely organized online, and so we need those platforms for that. But I think it's also right that they have become vehicles for all kinds of nefariousness, that they have been slow, as Andre points out, to wake up to that potential. They've been myopically focused on their own security, but not on kind of strategically how they orient themselves to deal with problems like deep fakes, like the role of AI and its potential to, at scale, distort our discourse. And so I think the question is, is there potential for not self-correction, but for correction? I think one of the most sort of dangerous things has been this idea that organizations like PEN America and many other human rights groups subscribe to for a long time, which is that any form of digital regulation whatsoever was an inherent danger to free expression and had to be avoided and opposed. And I think that was a mistake. I mean, I think there was a time where trying to instantiate principles of an open internet was very important. It remains important, and there are real threats to that. The Chinese vision of cyber sovereignty, I think, is pretty terrifying. And now, Google's at least flirtation with the possibility, of re-entering the Chinese market and really sacrificing, pretty much everything they've ever said from a principled standpoint as a country, is a pretty stark reminder of what we're up against, which is the profit imperative and the size of these companies and their kind of ferocious demand for users, for advertising revenues, and how that cuts against this early set of idealistic values that animated these firms. So I think it's a combination of their waking up, of startups, as you suggest, bringing new technologies that can hopefully get some of these forces under control, and a really difficult debate over how we regulate and how we even gain the expertise to regulate. One of the biggest problems in our own country and here in Europe is that the regulators are so glaringly lacking in the expertise to even understand what they're confronted with. I think we're going to need courts that deal with technology the way we have courts that are that specialize in corporate law.
You're absolutely right. When Mark Zuckerberg went in front of the United States Senate, I don't think I've ever been more mortified and depressed in recent history. You had senators who had absolutely no idea, and alarmingly, they weren't even properly briefed. So you had a guy who was able to sit there and completely parry very essential, simple questions about, what's his business model?
It was the same here over the Cambridge Analytica case, where he was almost sort of schooling the parliamentarians like you would, your grandmother about kind of the basics of how these systems work. And it's, we have an embarrassing amount of catch-up to do in order to even consider sound proposals.
This is part of the essential question as we move from this kind of blocky world where, I'm quite middle-aged, so I was used to taking large tracts of information, an essay, let's say, reading it, or a science paper, reading it to the end, and now we're in the streaming world, but our politics and our legal structures are stuck still in that other world, so there's a natural tension in that space.
Talking about the cooperation, so maybe this is my question as for Andre. Do you think that we shall create a special kind of like a league of democracies against cyber threats? Do you think, for instance, that it's time to launch, let's say, a kind of like, or establish a global cyber NATO or something like the organization such as this?
Well, first of all, I think the governments, for the most part, are already pretty active in this. It's not very visible, but it is totally true that most of intelligence operations have moved to the online space. Most of even like military, most militaries today actually spend comparable amount of money on kinetic and cyber preparation, cyber warfare, and that's a fact that will only get bigger. We are kind of in the era of moving really to the cyberspace in this regard, where potential war, where potential battles are going to be played. So that's one thing. But in terms of corporations, I have some doubts about that. The problem, I think, is that there's one thing that all corporations in the world have in common. It is desire for profit. That is, corporations by design were created to create profit and to somehow generate profit for themselves and for their shareholders. And I think that creates this very weird dichotomy where you've got maybe these very, noble aims and objectives of the corporation on one hand. On the other hand, you really have to generate money to survive, because for corporations, money is like oxygen. And so it really comes down to the business model, to what Jonathan said. If there are ways to create business models for corporations to actually thrive in this new environment, to, for example, detect or kill deep fakes, I think that's going to be terrific, but I have some doubts about that. That is, I think the fundamental has to start with some kind of awareness and education. I worry that consumers are generally not aware and are not even if they were aware, the biggest fear I have is that they wouldn't even necessarily care to the extent that they would be willing to do something or to sacrifice something, to give up something out of their convenience to actually undo these things. And that's I think, something we have to deal with.
Okay, maybe it's time for questions. Yeah, I shall be like throwing this, but I'm not sure if I'm able to do it, actually. Well, let's try, but I will maybe kill you, or... No. I will do it like this, okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you very much. My name's Graham Henderson. I run an arts organisation in London. I just wanted to ask the panel, given the scale of the technological revolution that we are facing and the fact that it's affecting absolutely everything in our politics, is it time for us to step back and start thinking about digital sovereignty, about a digital constitution and how that might look? Not treating the technology as an outside disruptor, but saying this fundamentally changes the way that society is going to operate in the future, and we need to go back to some basic founding principles. I myself have written, following Thomas Hobbes, about whether we need a digital leviathan to create the civil space in which an effective freedom, an effective politics can take place? Is what we really need a digital Benjamin Franklin and similarly like-minded people to sit down and start designing the new template for how democracy works?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we just like let Vivian to answer, and then we will just like throw the microphone somewhere else, okay? And maybe Suzanne also. Yeah.
Oh.
Wait.
Okay.
I love this.
Vivian.
This is fantastic. Yes. No. What you're saying is exactly what our vision is. We are creating. We're trying to democratize news and information, to take it out of the hands and control of, the rich and powerful, and put it back into the hands of the people. Again, with the kind of safeguards that you need so that we don't end up with mob rule. But it is an experiment. It is just the beginning. But the ultimate vision is to create exactly what you're saying is we need to look at the way that information is distributed and the way that information is discovered, received, and shared, and look at it through the lens of the fact that everything in our society has changed because of these devices. And how do we harness that to make sure that you were creating a platform that nobody owns, a platform that where there's nobody's getting rich, but collectively everybody is supporting and rewarding quality information. I know that sounds very idealistic. I understand that completely, but we do think that the blockchain affords that ability, and so this is our baby steps towards it. We're creating this experiment because we believe fundamentally in exactly what you're saying.
I mean, as I told Vivian earlier, I still don't really understand blockchain, but maybe it has all the answers for us. But short of that, I think you're right. I think we need more rules. The question is, how do we get to those rules when we have private actors that have such a huge influence, that are disincentivized to surrender any of their autonomy? They've come under some pressure, so that creates perhaps a new moment. We had a proposal that was put forward this week by the congressman who represents Silicon Valley, this set of internet principles that he is tabling for debate in a new Congress, assuming the Democrats take control of the Congress. Whether we'd be able to get agreement on something like that, even in our own country, I think is a huge question. We have these companies have massive policy offices in Washington, D.C., as Vivian well knows. To the extent these proposals run counter to their interests, and they haven't calculated that they're under sufficient pressure to have to accede to them, they'll resist mightily. And then, there's a larger question of whether, there's any scope for such a thing globally, because I think that there are countries, most notably China, that have a dramatically different view of how all of this works. So I think the international version of this is, tissue paper thin in terms of what anybody could agree on.
Yes, sure. Jonathan, do you want to add?
Digital identity. I think it's just a tragedy that the internet did incredibly well. I'm sure you'd agree, Andre. The internet was a kind of amazing miracle in terms of like the amount of stuff we actually got free, the protocols we got free. Like it runs pretty autonomously. The email as a protocol is there, and the web browsing. There, but identity was never really thought through. So essentially what Facebook has done is monetize your identity, your family pictures forever, and every data point you put in forever. I'm a little bit optimistic that the European Union will continue to smash that business model, and I think it would be interesting. Certainly in Africa, my group were thinking a lot about, if you were a child born in Zambia, let's say, next year, could you have a digital identity from the state as they do in Estonia? Probably, Estonia is a really good model for this. So when you're born, your digital life starts, and all of the data that you produce is your sovereign territory, and you can spend it. If I want to use Google Maps, maybe I need to push them some tiny micro value to use it. but in return, it's not being mined. You know, at the moment, we just have a disastrous business model for citizens, and I think, as you were saying, everyone was saying about China, which is, you know, Putin. I mean, China is really happy that we distrust Putin, but Putin's, you know, he's a sideshow, right? He's not. I don't say he's irrelevant, but you know, China's where all of our intelligence has to be focused.
Jaroslav Anděl, listening to you and seeing what has happened, I think one has to ask this question: are we ready for this powerful technology, both for tremendous positive potential, but more importantly, for their negative abuse? And I'll give you just a couple of examples. Yes, you remember bungling of cybersecurity of American Democratic Party, and it was both FBI and Democratic Party. I mean, stealing the data, and you know what happened then. And another example is this conference. A year ago, there was a very similar panel with different panelists, of course. And the question was, is new technology destroying democracy? So there was CEO of Avast, Vincent Steckler. And do you know what was his response?
No.
Guess. He said, "Don't worry. The problem is with us. It's not technology." And he gave an example of Facebook that there were ads bought for $100,000. And he said, "It's just the noise in the system. It doesn't have any impact whatsoever." We know better now with Cambridge Analytica. But just think of it. Head of leading cybersecurity company is saying this just 1 year ago.
I will take your microphone. So, who will
I
answer
think
a
Andre
question?
should take
Or
that.
do you want to? Thank you.
Well, to add, my point here would be that technology is always a sort of agnostic thing, in the sense that it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. That's been the case with technology from kind of the beginning of mankind, right? So it really is up to us people to decide what we do collectively with the technology. I mean, this particular case, I mean, what we discussed, what I see, for example, in terms of identity management, there's been many projects along the way have been created as kind of open source projects or somehow funded by corporations or even governments. Somehow they didn't take off, and I think fundamentally it's never been a technological problem in the sense that they wouldn't be good enough. It was always a problem, again, back to the point of kind of consumers not really necessarily caring or seeing the problem and being aware of the problem. And so it kind of has to start with people actually, you know, wanting to change something and realizing the problem.
Now, I'll push back a little bit on that, Andre. I mean, if you look at India, I mean, it's a very primitive platform, but Aadhaar is the Indian digital identity biometric. So 1.2 billion people, at least 800 million of them don't have a bank account. Probably never going to have a bank account, but they're somehow brought into that digital world, and they're identified by their iris recognition. I actually think, you know, the European Union is quite well placed to rather aggressively, and I know the EU Commissioner, she's very interested in pushing this, to very aggressively set up a sort of Facebook Lite, which EU citizens could, you know, have some of the functionality of Facebook without the advertising streams. But, you know, this is a longer conversation.
Anything to add, Suzanne, Vivienne?
You know, I've been thinking a lot about this question of, you know, can you kindle in the consumer this appetite for kind of a more conscientious approach, whether it's to privacy or to discerning, between the sources of news that are available to them. And, as you say, it's very difficult. And I don't think we can rest at, the consumer is going to have to want this. I mean, if you think about how we've effectuated public health revolutions on things like smoking or exercise, it's not just because people wanted to live longer. It's because governments took action, courts took action, and, we brought about a different kind of societal consensus. So I think, while I agree with you, ultimately we want a more empowered consumer, it's not good enough to just sort of leave it up to the masses.
Great.
Good afternoon. My name is Konstantin Eggert, and I'm a Russia columnist for Deutsche Welle. And my question is to Jonathan. You mentioned that because of this sort of proliferation of echo chambers, lots of what used to be called old media or classic media, or media of record, have become indistinguishable from each other. And so I agree with you. I think that there's no big difference between Breitbart and Slate, essentially. But what I think is, what my question is, do you think it's this process of basically huge polarization it's not going to roll back, essentially, that it's a course which leads somewhere else, but we're never going back to this kind of days of relative civility, relative balance? And as someone who works for a public broadcaster and used to work for 10 years for the BBC, do you think that this new digital future signifies the death of public service broadcasting?
Ooh, that's a great question, yeah. I think it raises some very profound questions of public broadcasting. There's a fundamental tension. You see that in Britain most obviously, where you want to have the first of all, we start to realize that what is neutrality, in the Brexit debate, what was a neutral position for the BBC to take, right? Was the neutral? I mean, it became very problematic. But secondly, there's tension with younger members of the country who have different way of absorbing media, right? But I think there is still a strong role for public service broadcasting, and it's really weird that there are some areas of media which are actually rebounding. For example, book publishing, which is not public, but book publishing is really on steep ascent in most countries now. And radio, including public radio, is actually quite sticky. It's an old technology, but somehow it's pretty sticky in the modern world. People get up in the morning, they go for a run, or they put on their kettle. That's a very interesting point. I think we have to really, to be honest, I don't think we have a sensible debate about any of this without the neuroscience and the way that we absorb media. But there is a lot of tension for public service broadcasters about how far they go. But I would think, particularly if you have a smaller language group, for example here in the Czech Republic, it's something that bothers me and I worry about all the time in the Czech Republic, because my wife is Czech and my children are half Czech, but we lived in Africa for much of our life. And most Czech people have no idea, unless they speak English or German or French, they literally have no source of knowledge about Africa. Of course, the Czech government doesn't think to invest in sending 3 reporters to Africa and reporting on it. So it gets back to the essential question we talked about at the beginning, which is like, reporting costs money. It doesn't cost a lot of money compared to the defense industry or the oil industry, but it does cost a lot of money. And somehow the demos, the people, have to say, somehow we're going to have to pay for that.
Another question.
James Spender from London, British Chamber of Commerce, and also Kipepeo Foundation, which is an educational charity active in Kenya. A number of people have already mentioned the need for educating the young in order to instill democratic values and an understanding of what is fake news. What would you recommend in terms of courses and materials? The Electronic Freedom Foundation, crypto parties, there are a number of MOOCs and other courses out there, the Khan Foundation. What else would you recommend that we would spread?
There's a,
Go ahead.
yeah, there's a number of different, at least in the United States, there's a number of different efforts at news literacy that have not been that successful. Part of the challenge is by trying to introduce news literacy curriculum into school. Well, in the U.S. it's difficult because it's every, states and even some communities all make their own rules. And it's also perceived to be, as everything is, unfortunately in the United States now, to be political. So there's a fear that by teaching children basically critical thinking skills is what we're talking about, that somehow that will be some kind of brainwashing, is read these news organizations and not those. So it's been difficult getting some traction. One of the most successful news literacy programs I've seen is actually in Italy. There's an organization that actually in every single school in Italy. It is in large part because it's got tremendous funding by big corporations out of their funds that they used for societal projects, and by the big newspaper organizations, where they actually are. But because in Italy the schools curriculum are centralized, they're able to pull it off. So it's mixed results. It's the same issue that Suzanne was talking about before, which is you can't necessarily rely on people's desire to want to seek out information in order to affect change. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there are programs that have been tested and do seem to work relatively well. There's one called the News Literacy Project. But the problem has been scaling them. There is just, as Vivian says, it's very decentralized in our country. There's been a lack of funding. There are a few states that have adopted measures requiring news literacy curricula in schools. And I think that's the level at which we have to tackle it. If it's school system by school system, it is never going to take hold.
We do have a space for time for two last questions. So first and then second. Sorry.
Agnieszka Markiewicz, I'm director of American Jewish Committee Central Europe. We're discussing here how we can counter the issue of fake news, which are distributed, by unknown factors. Well, if they're fully unknown, that's another story. I wanted to ask perhaps your perspective on another issue, which is the kind of debate and the kind of discourse and the vision of the world that is distributed by official media, which are controlled by the governments in some of the Central European countries, which are sort of, we can even say that they're political party sponsored, either through direct political control, like in the case of Poland, for instance, but also through the fact that they're owned that the media companies are being owned by people with strong connections to the governments. And I think that when we're not limiting our audience only to young people who have broad access to social media, but I'm talking about traditional media, who also to a very great extent shape the outcomes of the elections and the shape and the quality of democracy that we have.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, maybe it will be for Vivian, Jonathan. I don't know, because, I just add one more thing. You were talking about Poland, but let's say the situation in the Czech Republic is more or less similar, but everybody is talking just about Poland and Hungary. So I would add just one thing. What do you think? It is okay that the main media outlet in the Czech Republic are now in hands of our prime minister, who is a political hegemon and business hegemon? It's the question. Jonathan.
I think it comes back to I also think when you look at the Czech media scene now, some of the most impressive reporting is kind of off off the mainstream, you know. I mean, there's young Czech reporters who are getting out there and doing video stories, and it's messy, though. I have to say, it's messy when you have very large EU contracts and collusion, tycoons, people behind the tycoons, their companies, and so on and so forth. It's highly problematic. Essentially, you need a new media law, right? Which is much more aggressive at cutting down those links. I don't really have anything radical to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously it's a huge problem in authoritarian countries. The control of the media is one of the #1 tactics that is used to suppress dissent and maintain a government in power. And so here, you know, it's a somewhat more diffuse situation where these are not the exclusive media outlets, but they're important media outlets, and I think the consumer probably very often doesn't make a clear distinction between who's behind the stories that they're reading and what their agenda is. So I think part of it is greater transparency so that when those stories are shared, whether it's on Facebook and Twitter are the prime platforms through which most people get their news today. So understanding, being able to click and easily see, who owns this outlet, is it linked to the government, fostering media diversity so that there are other channels, the problem of disinvestment and the erosion of the business models, which drains away funding and robustness and other sources of media, is certainly part of it. And maybe, maybe there is a regulatory answer. I don't know. I mean, in our country, we have a kind of informal, there's no formal ownership relationship, certainly not that we know of, between Trump White House and Fox News, but there's an informal collaboration that is very intense and that allows you to know when you tune into that station, you're going to hear a point of view that's basically made in the White House.
Well, somebody mentioned Hobbes before, and I do think, I'm British, so I feel this, this in our blood a lot. But one of the most depressing things in the United States, and obviously you can see it in Central Europe as well, is the inability to have a competition for ideas. One side is sort of complete denial on the right, and then on the left, a kind of microaggression movement where people are incredibly confused and conflicted about many, many social issues as well as political, as well as economic issues. And, the systemic questions of who we are as a species, what is our contribution to the large part of humanity which lives in poorer parts of the world, what is actually going to happen to the living state of our biosphere in the next 20, 30 years. These are the critical questions that need to be clear and present, and they're not there. But I do think your point about Facebook, Suzanne, is they're stealing maybe 60% of advertising revenues, so it's very hard to create a business model.
Yep.
So, I'm really sorry, but it's like our time is over. I would like to summarize and put like 3 conclusions of this discussion. So, what we were talking about. First, we are really moving very quickly with technology. Very soon, no one will believe anything at all, and that's really a worry for humanity. Second, no single answer to fix it, but the tech giants and companies desire for profit, so they must change somehow their business model from profit-driven model, let's say. And the last one, how do we regulate the situation? Well, we need to defend the integrity of media and information being put out. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our panelists. You were absolutely fantastic. Thank you, the audience, for the attention, and thank you for your provocative questions. And let me finish this panel discussion with one quote. It was written shortly before the Second War by Karel Čapek, who is a very famous Czech writer, who, by the way, invented the word robot. And he wrote the following text, which is really nowadays relevant, as for me, more than ever. Let me quote, God, you who created the nations, and you who gave us a breath of desire to live in honor, Free the world of the worst thing, lies. Lies that support and prepare the path of violence and teach people to hate each other. Lies that poison the nations and excavate the abysses between them. No one, no nation, no state should feel safe as long as human relations can be corrupted by the instruments of lie. There will be no certainty, no treaties, nothing valid and safe, if the conscience of any nation will be distorted by an intentional lie. Each lie contains intrigue and violence. Each lie is an attack against the safety of the world. Freeing the world of lies is more than disarmament. God, bring back truth to the world. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.